Second, 2025 Planning Commission meeting, Lake Stevens, Washington. If I could please have a call to order, beginning with Commissioner Connor Davis.
Here.
Thank you.
Here.
Commissioner Matz.
Here.
Thank you. And Commissioner Packard,
Here.
Commissioner Dewar,
Here.
and Commissioner Morton.
Present.
Thank you. I am Chair Huxford, and if you would please, does someone want to make a motion to excuse Commissioner Jennifer Davis?
I so move.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. So that was Commissioner Dewar and Commissioner Davis that first and seconded. Again, we're trying to keep things cohesive for the minutes. So if you could state your name, I know it sounds awkward. We all talk about ourselves during our meetings now, but that is something that we are trying to help with. So I'll try to remember if you don't. If you would all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much, and I appreciate again all of your participation in the meeting this evening. Before we move on to guest business, if I may take a moment and just personally and as a commissioner, acknowledge the passing of Councilmember Tagent. He will be missed, and I pray for peace for his family. With that, let's move on to any guest business. Seeing none in the audience, is there any online? Okay, guest business aside, we'll move on to our action items as a commission. The first being to approve the minutes of our last meeting on May 21st. Has everybody had the opportunity to review those meeting minutes? Were there any questions, additions, suggestions for Dawn as she compiles our dialogue? There was a lot of dialogue in that last meeting. It got condensed, but there was a lot of dialogue there. Anything you wish to have added? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve?
I, Commissioner Packard, make a motion to approve.
Do I have a second?
Morton, seconds.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. It's the only place on the planet where you can say, "I, Commissioner, fill in the blank." So let's take the opportunity. But again, it's helping for the minutes, so I appreciate that. We have some discussion items this evening that are going to be brought to us by Principal Planner Leviton. Discussion item A, continued discussion of our STEP housing conversation.
All right. Thank you, Chair Huxford. David Levitan, Principal Planner. So we are here tonight to continue our discussion of STEP housing. I know that there were several commissioners that weren't present a couple of weeks ago, so I think this will be really useful and helpful for staff to get some additional feedback, especially from those commissioners. But we also wanted to bring back some additional items, provide a general summary of some of the discussion and feedback that we received, and then just talk a little bit about next steps. So just a reminder of what is STEP housing. So STEP housing is basically a continuum of housing essentially for members of the community that are facing homelessness in one way or another. It can range from emergency housing and emergency shelters, which are very immediate needs and tend to be a more temporary solution. Transitional housing, which is typically for a period of up to 2 years and provides that transition between potential homelessness into more permanent housing. And then what's called permanent supportive housing, which essentially is typically geared towards members of the community with supportive service needs, whether that be disabilities, whether that be substance abuse. It can be a variety of things, but that housing is intended to be permanent, whereas these other three types tend to be transitional in nature in some effect. So I'm going to include a couple of the slides from last time, especially just for the commissioners that weren't here. We had provided a couple of maps. So basically, House Bill 1220, which was adopted back in 2021, required cities to update their zoning codes to allow for different types of step housing in different zones in the city. So for emergency housing and shelters, they are required to be allowed in any zone where a hotel is permitted. And here in Lake Stevens, that is generally within our sub areas, basically our commercial and mixed use zones that tend to be either in downtown Lake Stevens along 20th Street Southeast corridor or within Lake Stevens Center, Frontier Village area. So basically the red areas and the purple areas. Not permitted, is not required to be permitted in any of the yellow, orange, brown, which are our residential zones, or the blue areas in the northeast, which are our industrial zones. Similar to other types of step housing, local jurisdictions may limit occupancy and spacing, intensity of use, basically grant some local control. Basically, the state requires us to allow them, but does allow for some level of local regulations. And then like a lot of other things like Oxford houses, which was the type of housing that I was searching for about 10 minutes at the last meeting and couldn't remember the name of it. Not allowed to regulate the number of unrelated persons as far as deeming something a family unit. So basically treating it similarly. When you look at the other component of step housing, so the transitional and permanent supportive housing, those uses are required to be allowed not just in areas that allow for hotels, but also that allow for residential units. And that's either multifamily residential or single family residential. So that opens up the majority of the city. So in addition to the red and the purple, that opens up all of the shades of yellow, the orange, and the brown. So as you can see, other than the blue and the green, which is the public, semi-public, there's not a whole lot of areas in the city that are not required to allow for transitional and permanent supportive housing. Just providing a little bit of feedback. I don't want to get into it in great detail. We got into it a little bit more in the staff report for the May 21st meeting. But our comprehensive plan and the growth targets that we had established had basically established the need, especially for emergency housing and for permanent supportive housing, showed that the city needed about another 454 units, I believe was the number of permanent supportive housing. So there is definitely a documented need in Lake Stevens. So this process, as far as updating the code, is about figuring out how to develop code language that best meets the needs of the Lake Stevens community. So we went over the Washington State Department of Commerce guidance and best practices. Basically what they encourage local jurisdictions to do is to allow step housing as an outright permitted use, as opposed to requiring, say, a conditional use permit, encouraging these types of uses near service, jobs, and transportation, minimizing what's called an operation plan, basically how you're going to provide all of your services, how you're going to deal with transportation and public safety, and, access to services, all the different components of it. Recommends that cities don't have super high parking requirements because the parking demand is typically less within these uses. And then just making sure that if you are going to be establishing development regulations, that you provide the necessary nexus between things such as spacing, occupancy, and intensity, and why they're being implemented to basically maintain public health and safety. So as mentioned, we did have an initial discussion at our last meeting just about 12 days ago. So definitely there was a diverse set of ideas, but I think that there was definitely some common ground. Russ, Director Wright, had pointed to how this dovetails with some of the other recent state legislation that's looking to basically provide as clear and objective and prescriptive requirements as possible, so that if you basically can point to your regulations and say, this is how you get to project approval, instead of having super subjective process and super subjective, say guidelines or requirements, something that's not easy to follow. So that's kind of a trend in Washington state land use currently. And so, making sure that we can incorporate that into our STEP housing regulations. There were different ideas as far as the level of review that should be involved, but I think there was general consensus that transitional and permanent supportive housing should be treated a little bit differently than emergency housing and shelters. As a reminder, the emergency housing and shelters would only be permitted within our commercial areas. They're more likely to occur there. The transitional and permanent supportive housing is probably more likely to happen within existing residential neighborhoods. And so there definitely are different components to the two different sets of uses. So the general thought was that we should treat them a little bit differently. There was some interest in seeing examples of each housing type, and there's definitely not a monolith housing type within any one of these particular housing types, but I am going to share some examples from throughout the region. And then just the importance of public engagement and making sure that we get that knowledge out there, acknowledge that there's going to be concerns, that there's going to be fear, and basically providing the information we need, that we are going to have adequate regulations in place to ensure that we meet that documented need of both existing and future residents, while also understanding that there do need to be, some level of review and some level of development standards to address concerns related to public health and safety, especially. So just as we talked a little bit about public engagement, wanted to look at some of the guidance from the Department of Commerce. I'm not going to get into great detail on this, especially because you can't really read it, but these are just some tips that they have when you're developing your engagement. Establishing shared values, really leaning into the concept of unity and community, showing lived experiences as far as people that have, transitioned through different types of housing and the intent is to make it into permanent housing. A lot of this is transitional in nature. We need to help community members in need as they transition from, say, potential homelessness into a hopefully more permanent housing situation. And then really just identifying kind of and providing a call to action, tying it back to the documented needs. Tying it in to really that the community looks after all members of that community. And so these are nothing that are set in stone at this point. These are just some general ideas as we start to develop our public engagement plan. So as far as public engagement, there are definitely, there are some cities that have made their way through and adopted their STEP housing regulations and wanted to look through some of the examples of how they really got that word out to the community. We're getting into the summer season. Russ Christie and I met after our last meeting to talk about Aquafest and a couple other things, the farmers market, some opportunities to really get out in front of a number of people to share kind of very clear and concise information, to have, FAQs ready, to have information ready to address comments and concerns from the community. So Burien had held a specific open house and expert panel last fall. And then Whatcom County actually developed a video just on permanent supportive housing, which I thought was really helpful. Even if we don't develop our own, there are definitely a lot of resources out there that we can utilize. And so that really went in to the role of permanent supportive housing, how it does provide that transition, in some cases, and how it really meets the need of community members with specific disabilities that really need these wraparound support services. So really providing information in a variety of different media formats is really going to be important. So we talked a little bit about that we didn't have really a lot of good examples of STEP housing in Lake Stevens currently, and that rings true for Snohomish County as a whole. When you look at basically the growth targets in the county, outside of the city of Everett, there's almost no STEP housing anywhere in the county, and there have been tens of thousands of units allocated across the county. So it's going to be, a major effort, and it's going to be difficult, but we wanted to kind of document some of the existing affordable housing that we have. That's a little bit different in nature, but it shows how different types of housing can be integrated into existing residential neighborhoods. So these are just a couple of examples of residential development, one owned by the Housing Authority, one owned by Mercy Housing, one that's just south of here and one that's just north of here. And so those just show example. They don't necessarily need to be large multifamily residential structures. They can be a variety of different types of housing, different types of housing forms, different numbers of stories of levels of housing. So there are definitely opportunities to incorporate this and to incorporate the design review process, basically treat them similarly to other housing types, perhaps with some operational requirements as well, but they're not necessarily going to stick out like a sore thumb. Looking throughout the region, these are some examples of some permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. They can range everything from Quixote Village in Olympia, which is a tiny home village, kind of a round, more central building that provides those permanent supportive housing services, basically the wraparound services. It can be larger multifamily residential buildings like Andy's Place in Everett. And then there's one called Michael's Place in Seattle, which is specifically for veterans housing. So again, you have an example of one that's, on the right there in Seattle that's tucked within kind of primarily a single family residential neighborhood that's kind of, transitions a little bit into multifamily as you get it out onto the arterials. You have one along an arterial in Everett that shows, trying to utilize that site as much as possible and build as many units as possible. So that's the type that, might be appropriate within a commercial zone, but that, would exceed the height limits here in Lake Stevens for a single family residential zone. So that might be allowable within a sub area, but it wouldn't be permitted, say, within, our traditionally single family residential neighborhoods. And then the Quixote Village is just an example of tiny homes. There's been all sorts of buzz and kind of legislation and rulemaking related to tiny homes, and we're still kind of working on that. So that's might be a little bit more of a difficult concept, but it's proven to be successful in different places. It allows for a sense of individual ownership on a very obviously small scale, while also providing the necessary services for some of these types of uses. On the flip side, a lot of times we imagine emergency housing and emergency shelters to just be kind of these large commercial or industrial buildings. That's not always the case. So we have Cocoon House there in Everett. It's, you can't even really tell between the two structures. The one on the right is Cocoon House. It looks very much like other buildings within the neighborhood. That's specifically a teen shelter. We have the Leverick Family Village in Stanwood, which is kind of a low rise, kind of primarily single family residential looking development in Stanwood that allows for individual, families to be in separate buildings. And then Maud's House in Marysville, which is specifically a women's shelter, which has kind of been incorporated into more kind of like a small suburban office park environment. And so there's a lot of different housing and building types that these uses can be accommodated within. So we had talked at our last meeting about a number of cities that have adopted their step housing regulations over the last few months. We specifically had focused on Edmonds, Linwood, and Redmond at your last meeting on May 21st. Edmonds was definitely the least, had the lowest threshold as far as regulatory requirements, step housing, whether it be transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, or emergency housing or shelters. There were basically no supplementary use regulations in Edmonds. And so that was kind of on one end of the spectrum. Redmond was definitely the most prescriptive. So that not just for emergency housing and shelters, but also for permanent supportive and transitional housing. They basically kind of lumped them all in together, which was maybe not quite what the majority of the commission expressed their interest in doing. It required a 1/2 mile buffer between each individual developments, which would be, once you start doing that, there's not going to be a whole lot in a city the size of Lake Stevens. So Russ and Christy and I had kind of looked over that. That felt kind of a little, if not a lot of overkill, just as far as I looked back through their ordinance. I didn't really see a whole lot of explanation for why they created such a large buffer. But so in between those two, we wanted to look at some additional ones, and specifically within Snohomish County and North King County. So Everett, Marysville, and Shoreline have also adopted their regulations over the last year. So in Everett, and reminder that this slide is for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. The next slide is going to be for emergency housing and emergency shelters. So in Everett, there's kind of a trend within these three, Everett, Marysville, and Shoreline, is that they don't have really prescriptive supplementary use regulations for permanent supportive housing or transitional housing, kind of similar to Linwood, definitely similar to Edmonds, and a little bit different than Redmond, which had very prescriptive standards even for these types of uses. So Everett does not have supplementary use regulations or require an operational plan, and it doesn't have any spacing or buffer requirements. Marysville is probably kind of the next step up. There's no supplementary use regulations within their code, but the footnotes to their permissible use table does note that an operations plan is required. But it's not nearly as prescriptive as a lot of these other cities that says exactly what you need to have in there. It basically is a little bit more subjective in nature. Notes that you need to do some public outreach, but it doesn't say what exactly that needs to be. And then there are no spacing or buffer requirements. And then the city of Shoreline does have supplementary use regulations for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, but they are pretty limited in nature, just noting that they need to be operated by either a public agency or a nonprofit, that if they provide on-site supportive services in residential zones, they're exempt from some of the regulations, and then those do not have any sort of spacing or buffer requirements. So basically, you don't need to have any particular distance between any individual use and another use. And that's either between individual uses or between that use and, say, a school or a park or some other sort of kind of protected land use. When we move on to emergency housing and shelter, though, and part of the reason that we had included these three, the Everett, Marysville, and Shoreline, is because they kind of are in line with some of what we had heard from the Planning Commission, is that they definitely do treat emergency housing and emergency shelters differently than the former. And so, say the city of Everett requires a management responsibility plan. That addresses things like admissions and inspections, emergency services. It requires a transportation plan. It requires a code of conduct. It requires, as opposed to being outright permitted, it requires an administrative use permit, which is kind of similar to our administrative conditional use permit. It requires a pre-application and notice to property owners within 100 feet. So this is before you submit your required land use application. You are required to do some noticing and hold a pre-application meeting. In Marysville, that noticing about quadruples up to 600 feet, and it's required 15 days prior to actually formally submitting your land use application. The city of Marysville for housing, emergency housing and emergency shelters requires an operations plan to describe things like access to nearby services and a safety plan. And then it actually has kind of two levels. Basically, if you're 30 residents or fewer, it's outright permitted. But if you go up over 30 residents, then it requires a conditional use permit, which here in Lake Stevens would be a type 3 process. So that would kind of kick off all sorts. It would actually need to go to the hearing examiner if it were a full-fledged CUP. We also have an administrative conditional use permit process here, which is a type 2 that still requires public notice, but does not require a public hearing before the hearing examiner. And Marysville is actually one of the few that actually had buffers not between individual uses, but between schools. So for emergency housing and emergency shelters, cannot be located within 600 feet of schools. And then it also, Marysville had a couple of different layers and levels for a couple of different components of their regulations. One of those is also that within residential zones, you cannot provide social services on site. And so we are not required to allow emergency housing and emergency shelters within residential zones. That's not what the state legislation requires. Marysville decided to allow them within some higher density residential zones. So this last part is a little bit, unless the commission would like to expand where emergency housing and emergency shelters are required to be allowed, this is maybe not applicable, but it just shows that Marysville, had really an eye for detail and really considered a lot of different things and different variables that occur in different parts of the city. And I actually thought they did a pretty good job with their code. Some of it maybe I would combine with a couple other places, but I thought that was a good example.
David, if I could jump in,
Yeah.
one of the topics that kept coming up in our last meeting is the social services availability in Lake Stevens. And so we were thinking about not only placement and regulations of the placement, but also where those people placed are going to receive the services that they require. So I wanted to give you a
Yeah.
moment to swallow.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to convey to the two that weren't here in that last meeting. And if there's any other commissioners that wanted to jump in at this point with any thoughts, but just so that you're thinking as this is being presented.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And then, yeah, just the final one that we hadn't touched on at the last meeting was Shoreline. So that they do have specific supplementary use regulations for emergency housing and emergency shelters. They needed, similar to permanent supportive housing, they're required to be operated by a public agency or nonprofit. But unlike those uses, emergency housing and shelters are required to have a code of conduct, a parking plan. They're required to allow periodic inspections. That being said, they are still outright permitted with no public notice required. So they still trying to keep it administrative in nature, but basically address some of the community concerns when it comes to things like parking and codes of conduct, maybe that are a little bit different between emergency housing and more stable housing like permanent supportive or transitional, where you have residents that are there for a longer period or duration. And there might be less need for some of those specific components of an operational plan. So with that, I just wanted to open it up, especially for the newer commissioners. If there are items from any individual city that you really like, that we can kind of provide the foundation for what we start to work on and present to the community. If there are ideas that you have specifically related to public engagement, as I mentioned, we're going to be going out to the community over the summer and really starting to get some feedback on this project, on the critical areas ordinance update, on our streets code. We have a lot of different code things. We're trying to make it digestible, easy to understand. If there are things that you really think we should be focusing on as part of this work. So really just wanted to open it up, continue our discussion from the last meeting, and answer any questions that you may have. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
This is Commissioner Matz. I have two quick questions for you. Section 8, so when I was doing this with City of Seattle, Section 8 housing fell into the emergency housing, which I always thought was odd to me. It felt like it was transitional or permanent.
Yeah.
Is there an area where that falls currently in what we're doing? Or is it not specifically called out?
Yeah, it's not specifically called out in the legislation. And I mean, Section 8 is more a funding source as opposed to a housing type. And so I'm not quite sure why the city of Seattle would have kind of structured it that way. Because that has to deal more with obviously how you pay for your housing. And so, yeah, we weren't planning on incorporating anything related to Section 8. Obviously, there are already all sorts of requirements at the state and federal level related to that. We're more, kind of we didn't go into it in great detail, but one of the main components and one of the very, one of the requirements of the code language is that you need to provide definitions. You need to distinguish between the different housing types. You need to note all the zones where they're permitted. So there's very basic information that we're going to provide within, chapter 1408 of the municipal code, which is the definitions section and some other sections. That's all pretty clear and objective. It's really get into how we want to handle operational components and noticing requirements and all of that, and how we distinguish between these individual uses. But, answering in a very roundabout way, no, we're not required to incorporate any discussion of Section 8 or any other types of housing funding as part of this.
Does the same apply then for what I call transitional housing, but rehabilitation types of housing for folks that are leaving Snohomish County Jail or have been in prison that are now reentering?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap there, but when it comes to things like sober housing or Oxford homes or, transitional housing, we have several in the southern part of the city off of 20th Street. And those are basically outright permitted anywhere where they're basically treated like single family residences. If they are within a single family residence, we don't have a lot of authority. There's been all sorts of case law related to this, including the city of Edmonds that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. That was specifically for Oxford homes. That was 30 years ago in 1995. That basically, the living arrangement and the makeup of the household, we basically are not legally allowed to treat them differently than, say, just your average household of related family members. So the recovery services, adult family homes are permitted anywhere that, residential units are allowed. So there are already a lot of state regulations related to those types of residential uses that House Bill 1220 didn't specifically touch on. We're probably going to need to clean up our definitions a little bit for some of the existing uses we have. We kind of adopted a couple decades back a lot of the definitions from Snohomish County for a different type of healthcare facility, from an adult home, up to Oxford houses, all of these types of things. So we're probably going to need to clean up that language as part of this, just so we can distinguish between those and, say, transitional housing or permanent supportive housing. There's typically no time limit on those. I mean, if somebody wants to live in an Oxford house for 5 years just because they find that it's productive and it helps them with their recovery, I've heard of people having long-term tenancy and those types of things that they prefer to live in that, that housing environment. So there's not any specific language related to those specific uses.
Other comments?
Hey, David, this is Commissioner Connor Davis. What percentage of our city population, if you know, is experiencing chronic homelessness?
I would have to probably look that up.
See if I can find something and take a look, but I do know the American Census does not have that data.
Right.
So I would have to probably go somewhere on Snohomish County and see if I could find data there.
I would say that the best data that we have is probably, from the school district when it comes to that, just because they do have McKinney-Vento data that, and there's different levels of homelessness. There's people that are, homeless, like living in their cars or living on the street. And then there's people that are couch surfing, that don't have a permanent home. So this is, it's a very complex issue. And the data that supports it is kind of sometimes hard to come by, and, getting that supporting data can be difficult, but I think that having, as much information does help to paint the picture. And, from the public engagement side of things, just documenting, that this is a need. I think people look at some place like Lake Stevens and they see, you have a beautiful lake right in the front. We have people frolicking in the water, but we still, like the rest of the region, have real world issues.
I just think that from the perspective of teaching and the number of students that I realize are getting services through McKinney-Vento. Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the need within the city.
Yeah.
And, kind of the geographic areas, if it, it's perhaps along 20th Street, if it's more so on the north side of the city. And it is looking at Edmonds seem to have, like I said, the most least restrictive, even in terms of just geographic areas within the city, that there's, at least from what I could read, little to no restrictions on where this type of housing could be located. Is that correct?
It is, and I think there's a couple, I live in Edmonds, and I think there's a
Yeah.
couple things that go into that. One, I think that there generally is, a desire to, especially within South County, to accommodate as many of these uses as possible. But there's also the realization, especially in a city like Edmonds, where the property values are like pretty high, that it's going to be difficult. I mean, just because you allow it everywhere doesn't mean that it's going to happen anywhere. So it's almost just kind of letting the market take over a little bit.
And that gets to my, call it a concern, but there are neighborhoods and areas within Lake Stevens where this type of housing is, if you're a developer, is the most likely. And I do look at, how we as commissioners can make recommendations to the council, how the language is created to, I'm just thinking, okay, where are the, chronically homeless, maybe if they're transitioning right now, where's a permanent address for us to kind of gauge and have, I think of like a map, and we're putting little pinpoints on the map. Is I don't want to have a situation where a particular neighborhood is feeling, again, I'm using the word like burden, but where that's where the focus for developers could potentially be in the future. Because that's a lot of weight for 1 or 2 or 3 neighborhoods to carry for an entire city.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it would be hard to have different, well, I mean, just the way that our zoning works, and, you can have R6 zoning, and vastly different demographics within the city.
Right.
It would be hard to distinguish. The only way really to address that would be if we had some sort of buffer requirements, that it either had some sort of maximum number within a certain, diameter, circumference or diameter, however you want to do it. Or having specific distances between individual uses. I mean, is your concern more on the emergency housing and emergency shelter side of things, or on kind of all components of it?
The objective reality, and there's no way to sugarcoat it, that a lot of this type of housing does come with disparate impacts on neighboring communities when it comes to property crime. That is just that it's baked in. That's the sad reality of it. To make sure that we do have the wraparound services from the city, with the police department, with emergency services to, and again, just goes back to my concern about it having a disproportionate impact on certain neighborhoods. I mean, everybody deserves a safe place to live, absolutely. And this can be done the right way, but I do look at how I think the laws in Washington State, this goes down a slippery slope, but there is, to put it frank, just a concern about where these could potentially be located, having too much of an impact on certain neighborhoods. I don't want to get too slippery here.
We got slippery last meeting,
Yeah.
so jump
Pick it up,
aboard,
put it down.
jump aboard. So I was very much for Linwood North, Linwood towards Redmond in our last discussion. And it wasn't so much as I was trying to regulate people out of transitional housing, or certainly to not allow for emergency housing where needed. My concern is for the people that already live here. And if you have made the investment to move to Lake Stevens, then find out that, this is moving in next door, especially where we don't have social services close in hand to what's moving next door to you. you are opening that up. Now, this evening, and after a couple of weeks of thinking about this, I do like some of the things that Marysville did where they are saying that you have to have provided services at this location. So yes, we're going to allow it. There's a certain buffer. I like buffers just because I don't want to make, have housing on top of housing or next to our schools where unnecessary. But that idea of having it so that you've got designated social services that are designed to help these folks. So know that there were a couple that were on the opposite side of that, that wanted to go the Edmonds route and say, free market, your ability to build and produce this kind of housing, be it as you will. So that's why we're trying to get everybody's feedback again tonight with more information. And I appreciate the additional spots a little bit further north. Sorry to make, I made a comment about Edmonds last week, forgetting that you live in Edmonds, but sorry about that.
I threw Shoreline in there too, so we weren't.
Yeah,
surprised, so.
okay. But I think that, Linwood North are really good examples of where we are. We just happen to be a city that more aligns, in my opinion, with the demographics down in Redmond. So hopefully that helps you not feel nervous about talking about slippery slope because we did that already. Any other comments? Let's bring up some more.
Yeah,
discussion.
this is Commissioner Dewar. I just make a brief comment. I would agree with Chair Huxford on the Linwood North concept. It's important to recognize that these projects can have these negative impacts. And one of the things that I was searching for in my mind and came to, because it was in this packet, was what happened at Claire's Place. Claire's Place was built in 2019, and by 2023, per the Herald, the authorities advised more than 60 residents and staff to evacuate Claire's Place after tests found fentanyl and methamphetamine contamination in 48 of the units. And then there was a further article in 2024 that apparently CCS knew about the contamination for months prior. And that really goes to why I believe it's critical for the city of Lake Stevens to come in before any of this kind of development gets even remotely started with a strong plan and a strong set of regulations on what would be acceptable and the terms and conditions that need to come along with building these sort of units.
This is Commissioner Metz again, so I agree with did I cut you off?
No, pull your mic up though. Make
Oh.
sure.
I agree with the Linwood North as looking most appealing. I think two other areas that you highlighted on the slides that other cities are doing is the transportation plan and parking plan. We don't have that around this city, so I think it's just as important to be planning for that, along with the housing and social services to support those things. We can't have a residential house turned into emergency housing and 60 cars trying to park there, so.
Dave, does the state require an annual inspection from the building official like an adult?
As far, I would have to check the state regulations. The question was whether there's any sort of requirement at the state level for annual inspections, similar to an adult family home. So I'm happy to look into that and potentially incorporate that into the regulatory language. If it's already required, then we wouldn't necessarily need to write it into our local regulations, but it's, never bad to be a little bit redundant and to call it out. Most places do, you can also just have general code language saying that you need to allow for the inspections as needed, to document, public health and safety, and that gives some leeway and some discretion for cities to implement programs to require that, but can look at that, from an inspection side of things.
I actually made that note in our last meeting, who regulates ? we can't regulate the air quality on Centennial Trail next to our pot grow and production, nor get recreational vehicles that are decrepit off the streets. So something like this that is behind walls seems to me even more cumbersome and concerning. But I will turn the time over to those who have not made comment yet this evening to add their comments.
Well.
You're dying to.
Well, no, this is Commissioner Morton. I still believe that less restrictions are desirable in my opinion. Because if there are, if there's an organization that feels that there's a need in our community for a facility such as these step categories, then that's a need that's needed by residents in our community. And if we are putting up roadblocks to impede that, then we are doing a disservice to people who would be served by those facilities. And I understand there's concerns about crime. Fortunately, we have laws already against those crimes, and those can be enforced just like any other type of home or apartment building or as such. So I could see the concern about having a facility that has homeless people right adjacent to a school. That is that I could see as being a concern, especially if there's potential crime. But again, the supportive and emergency housing, that's reserved for those industrial areas and high density areas. So I'm not sure how much of an overlap there is between schools in those areas. But that's I look forward to seeing what you all propose for regulations for this. I will be looking at them closely as they come.
Thank you. Commissioner Packard, you've been quiet this evening.
I did a lot of talking last
With-
time.
The microphone.
Yeah, I did a lot of talking last time. I don't think I have anything else today.
Okay. So the question this evening is, did we make clear direction for the city staff? And did we allow them our thoughts on how best to communicate this to the community? So have we made clear thoughts on where we are?
I think there's still obviously some differences of opinion, but I think we have general direction from the majority of the commission, and we'll try to address, as wide of a spectrum of those opinions as possible. But yeah, I think we've gotten good feedback. As far as the outreach, I think there was good feedback at the last meeting. If there's anything in addition, based on any of the new information that you'd like to provide, but we're going to have kind of a multi-pronged approach, getting, building out a project website, getting out to public events, trying to keep it as, non-Levitonese as possible. And so, yeah, I think we generally have good direction on both.
I will just say that the combination of what was discussed and presented last meeting with the addition of this meeting was helpful. So splitting out the two different categories, but adding in more good, not good, better, best, but less, middle, more.
Yeah.
Sort of may be a little bit more of an easy is not the word. It's going to be better received just for the educational standpoint with the general public.
Yeah, no, and I think the tables, graphics and maps are going to be a lot better received than a wall of text, obviously. And so we'll try to, I think there's ways to simplify it even more, but no, I appreciate the feedback, and that's what we were looking to do. And, to really provide some comparisons and just, show the spectrum of ways that you can handle this. We didn't include Edmonds because I think Commissioner Morton is, kind of more along the Edmonds route. But, the majority of what we had heard was sort of kind of more in the middle, kind of trending a little bit more, maybe not entirely to Redmond, but, something similar. And so introducing some of the ones like Marysville and like Everett that one distinguish between the two different types, and two do have very, more specific criteria and regulations specifically related to emergency housing and shelters, I think was a little bit more in line with kind of where the majority of the commission was.
Anything else from the commissioners this evening? Anything else from you?
That is it on this topic. Yeah.
Okay. Moving forward then, thank you for the discussion and the feedback. Jennifer Davis paid us all a great compliment last meeting, and I'll reiterate that in that this commission does its homework, and it's greatly appreciated. These are things that some behind the scenes, a little bit of preparation prior to the meeting goes a long way. So thank you all. Let's move on to commissioner reports, and let's start with you, Commissioner Morton.
I have nothing.
How about you, Commissioner Dewar?
Nothing this evening.
Commissioner Packard?
Nothing for me tonight.
And Commissioner Matz?
Nothing tonight.
Commissioner Connor Davis?
Nothing for me as well.
We are a clean sweep with no commissioner reports. Do we have a planning director's report this evening?
Christy Schmidt, Planning Manager. Russ Wright did not have a director's report for this evening, but I did want to point out, the commission was providing their thoughts on the step housing. I did find and research the Snohomish County Point in Time Homelessness Annual Study that they do. So I'll go ahead and send out that link for 2024, and the 2025 results should be coming soon. I was not able to find a specific city of Lake Stevens, but we'll inquire with our PD and the school district to see what stats that they have.
Thank you for doing that. And thank you, by the way, for the follow-up on the legislation bills. That was really interesting. Many of them conflict with each other, which in a sad, sick kind of way was fascinating to read through. So, but thank you for setting that up. That was something that came out of that last meeting. I will just say there is a council meeting tomorrow, and among other things, there are fees being implemented or discussed, if not voted on tomorrow night, that if we're talking about affordable housing, will take us farther away from that goal rather than add to it. So if anyone is interested in attending via Zoom or in person, tomorrow night's meeting should be one that I plan to attend. All right, with that, hearing no other reports, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Commissioner Connor Davis's motions to adjourn.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second, Commissioner Morton. All those in favor?
Hi.
And no one opposes. Thank you. Aye, Commissioner Davis. Commissioner, it's just so all powerful.
You do